Welcome to this walk through Philippians 2, verses 14 to 16. Recall that we're now seeing the implications of Paul's amazing vision in the Christ hymn of Christ's humility and his exaltation by the Father earlier in chapter 2. And the rest of the letter then shows us a bit of what life looks like for those who share in the mind of Christ as they bend the knee to Christ to the glory of God the Father, as Paul said in verses 10 and 11. Then in our last session, we began the section that comes right after the hymn, beginning in verse 12. Paul began right after the hymn, "Therefore, my beloved, just as you've always obeyed, not only when I was present, but now much more in my absence, with fear and trembling," or we thought maybe awe and trembling, "work out your own salvation." And I suggested for katergadzis the idea that it means to live in accordance with, or to do your salvation. When we were discussing this text in the Greek reading circle, one of the members, Tara Jernigan, suggested the translation exercise your salvation. And I think that conveys very nicely the idea that I think is going on here. So exercise your salvation, live out your salvation, do it with awe and trembling, for God is the one who's at work within you, both to will and to do, according to eudakias. Now, we didn't talk much about this word eudakias last time. According to BDAG, eudakia, or good pleasure, can refer to either God's own kindly disposition or to the state that his kindness brings about. And there's truth in both of those options, because in Christ we see the Father's disposition of kindness and mercy. And that's the whole ground of our salvation. Salvation flows from who God is and what he's like. And the state that his kindness brings about is that salvation that we exercise as God works in us. It's what's referred to in the hymn as every knee bending to Jesus and confessing him as Lord to the glory of God the Father. And that's a picture of the kingdom fulfilled, everything in alignment under the sun, and then given over to the Father. And again, 1 Corinthians 15:20 to 28 is the ultimate expression of that ultimate vision. So this is where we pick it up today, and in our next sentence, Paul touches very quickly on one particular issue at Philippi that is out of sync with the mind of Christ, namely grumbling and arguing. And he puts it in the context of their call to a different way of life for those in the commonwealth of heaven, as he'll refer later. So our next sentence goes from verse 14 down through verse 16. Panta poiete choris gangusmon kai dialogismon. I'll just take it that far to begin with. Panta poiete. Poiete here could either be an indicative or an imperative, and here in the context it's an imperative. Do everything. Horis. Now, horis is an adverb that also functions as a preposition, like here. And its basic sense is to be separated from. So here the idea is without. So do everything without gangusmon kai dialogismon. Now, gangusmon from gangusmos. Here you see, according to BDAG, gangusmos refers to utterance made in a low tone of voice. And the context indicates whether the utterance is one of discontent or satisfaction. So he suggests behind-the-scenes talk. And the negative aspect would be complaint, displeasure, expressed in murmuring. The word's used 17 times in the Greek Bible, and 5 of those are in Exodus 16, when the Israelites are complaining in the wilderness that they don't have anything to eat. And so God provides the manna and the quail. So Paul's echoing this Old Testament language and basically telling the Philippians, don't be like Israelites were in the wilderness. So do everything without grumbling or murmuring, and without dialogismon. So here's what BDAG has to say about dialogismos, and it's a very fascinating word, because it can refer to the process of reasoning, you see, or number 2, the content of the reasoning or conclusion. So it can mean either reasoning itself or the thought or opinion, reasoning or design that comes from that thinking. But thirdly, it can refer to verbal exchange that takes place when conflicting ideas are expressed. In other words, it can be dispute or argument. And then fourthly, reasoning that gives rise to uncertainty, doubt. So that's quite a spectrum of possible meanings. Here in our context, number 3 seems very clearly what's in mind, but this is a word well worth looking up some of the examples of text where these different senses show up. So Paul wants them to do everything without grumbling and arguing. Hina geneste amemptoi kai akeraioi. So that, probably a purpose clause, giving the purpose of the exhortation to do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you might be or become, probably become, because they probably are doing some grumbling and arguing, or else he wouldn't have to say this. And we hear in chapter 4 about a couple of the members of the community in particular that need to be reconciled. So, hina geneste, that you might become amemptoi kai akeraioi. Here are two more words in our sentence for today that are fascinating. Both of them have alpha privatives on the front, in other words, negating. And the first one from memptos, you see, blameworthy, from memphomai, to blame or find fault. So something that's blameless or faultless. This is according to Danker's Concise Greek-English Lexicon. And akeraios is fascinating because it comes from keronymi, unmixed, unaccompanied by anything else. You can find classical texts that talk about mixed wine or mixed metals, anything that's not pure. So here it's used only metaphorically of moral integrity in the New Testament, of pure innocence in the sense of unalloyed, not being mixed with other things of a different character. Both of these words are subject complements or predicate nominatives, predicate complements, depending on the terminology you want to use, so that you might become blameless and pure. Tekna theou amoma. Now, tekna here is can be taken as a third complement or more likely as apposition. And you see the comma right here shows the editors think of it as apposition. On either of these analysis, we line them all up. So you might become blameless and pure, children of God, amoma. So amoma is an adjective modifying tekna. We have another word with an alpha privative on the front. Momos means a blemish. So the idea here is without blemish. It's often used in the Septuagint for unblemished sacrificial animals. And when used metaphorically, again, we have the moral condition of being without fault and blameless. So the idea isn't sinlessness as such, but living a life that is reflective of God's character. And so the idea seems to be free from behavior that's not reflective of Christ's life and would promote God's glory rather than bring dishonor on the people of God. And that's a major theme throughout the Old Testament. We see Paul drawing upon it here as well. And in this particular case, it's grumbling and arguing that are the problem. So we've got three adjectives here, each of them with an alpha privative, and all of them pretty closely related in meaning. And they're sort of piled together here for emphasis, emphasizing this basic characteristic of the community that Paul is desiring. And if we stop and think about these terms, we see that they paint a picture. And this comes through if we translate them according to their basic meanings. It should be something like that you may be or become blameless, unmixed, children of God, without blemish. Now, if you think about that, an object can be pure, like pure gold, unmixed, and yet still have blemishes on it. So these two words together combine for a picture of something that's in a pure state without any defects or additions either within or without, on the surface or within, and thus completely without fault. In this case, Paul refers to the community as being in keeping with their identity as children of God. They have this condition because they share in the mind of Christ. And so they don't just stifle their grumbling and arguing. Their whole attitude towards one another is different. Their alignment with Christ brings them into union with one another, and so they are blameless before God. It doesn't mean they don't have differences with one another, but any differences can be worked out without grumbling and arguing. And that condition sets them apart from the world around them, as Paul now goes on to describe. So, picking it up with meson geneas golios kai diestramenes, in hois fineste, hos fosteris in cosmo. Just take it that far. So meson here, adjective from mesos, means the middle or the midst, and its neuter singular form functions as an adverb or can be taken as a preposition. You can check out BDAG section 1C, page 635 for that usage. Geneas, genitive singular from genea, generation, which is then modified by two adjectives. Scolios means to be curved or bent or crooked. And diastramenes, you can see you get an adjectival ending with a men in front of it, so you expect this to be a participle. And the men does not have an omicron in front of it, so that's often the signal for a middle passive perfect participle. So here's the parsing, and it's from diastrepho, to distort or twist or pervert, which in turn is from strepho, to turn. This participle in the perfect, probably an intensive perfect, focusing on the resultant condition. So Paul is talking about being in the middle of a crooked and distorted generation. Now, the use of this perfect participle in conjunction with scolios may reflect current usage in Paul's day. Hellerman in the EGGNT cites Bertram, as you can see from the Theological Dictionary. Diastrophe became a technical term in Hellenistic and Stoic ethics for the moral corruption of the empirical man. The nature of man, which is originally good and oriented to the good, is twisted, diastrephetai, by bad teaching and example, and by environmental influences of all kinds. Hellerman says Paul's view differs in some important ways from the Stoic view, and that's fair enough, but I think Paul would at least agree with the general notion that what was once good has been twisted. So the Philippian Christians are to be children of God who are blameless and without blemish, without mixture, in the middle of this crooked and perverse generation, among whom finesthe. Now notice the plural, hois, among whom, even though the antecedent back here is in the singular. It's because generation is itself a corporate idea. So this is just putting a relative pronoun according to the sense of the antecedent, the ad sensum use. So among whom finesthe. Now phino means to shine or give light. And in the passive, it means to come to light, to appear, to be manifest. And most English translations have shine here in this text, although the NASB has appear. And Paul is drawing upon Daniel 12:3. Here we read, Kai hoi sunientes, those who have understanding, phanusin, will shine, liquid future, hos phosteres, to uranu, like lights of heaven. Since the future here is in the active, it'll clearly mean shine. In our text, since this is a passive, if we keep the more common meaning for the passive, then Paul will be saying not just that these believers are shining, but they are coming to light, they're appearing, they're being manifest. It's a more dynamic picture of the coming of the light of Christ through his body in the dark world. That may be reading too much into this, and most translations, like I say, just go with shine here, and that's probably what I'll do as we go through. But you see there may be a little bit more involved here, or at least it's worth meditating on that level. Now, as phosteres in cosmo, phoster is something that shines, it's a luminary, it's a light. It's not the word for star, although it's often used for stars, or at least at times it's used for stars, and that's how most translations take it here, among whom you shine like stars in the world. The more specific word for star is aster, and in fact in the Daniel text, in the next line, past the one I quoted, there's a parallel with that word in it, ta astera tu uranu, the stars of heaven. So some translations of our text in Philippians have among whom you shine like lights in the world, or we could say like points of light. But the general idea is clear enough, whichever way we take that. Moving on to verse 16, we begin with this participle, logon zoes epechontes, the word of life, holding fast or holding forth. Some people think it means more evangelism, holding forth. Most take it, I think, rightly as holding fast or firmly to the word of life. It's a circumstantial participle, which may modify finesthe, or it may go back to genesthe. It could be taken in a number of different ways. We'll just walk through these, assuming it goes back to finesthe, although the exegetical opinion is pretty divided on this. You've got good scholars on both sides as to which word it goes back to. So it could be attendant circumstance. You shine and hold fast, or it could be causal. You shine because you hold fast. You shine by holding fast, or temporal. You shine as you hold fast. Hellerman suggests that it's either manner or means. I'm not sure what he means by manner. It's a very confusing term because it's understood in so many different ways by different people. Some people take the category manner very broadly for simply how something happened, but how is a very ambiguous term. Wallace notes that means also answers the question how. So Wallace sees manner as referring to an emotion or attitude, and simply adds color to a description. That's page 627 in his Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics. But Wallace's approach seems too narrow. And so I think the approach that works best is to take manner as the equivalent of a simple adverb. And on that view, manner would not be an option here. An example of a participle for manner in this adverbial sense would be something like Luke 22:65. They were saying many other things at Jesus, blasphemuntes, blaspheming, which we could think of as in a blasphemous or a slanderous manner. So they're holding fast to the word of life, logon zoes. It's fronted, moved up to the beginning here for emphasis, and both the object and its genitive modifier are anarthrous, and that's in keeping with Apollonius's canon, because usually a nominative with a genitive modifier will both have the article or both lack the article. Wallace discusses that on page 239. And then there's a corollary. Apollonius's corollary adds that, this is a quote, when both nouns are anarthrous, both will usually have the same semantic force. That's Wallace, page 250. So here, both nouns are referring to something definite. It's a particular message and a particular life. And so we translate this, holding fast to the word of life. Now, there are several options for this genitive, zoes. It could be a genitive of content, the word or message about life, source, the word sourced in or originating from life, attributive genitive, the living word, or genitive of product, the life-giving word. All those seem to me to be possibilities. The term zoe is used in only two other places in Philippians, in 1:20 and 4:3, so we don't have a whole lot to go on for how Paul's using the concept of life in this letter in particular. So it may be best simply to follow example of many English translations, at least the dozen that I checked, and translate simply the word of life or the message of life, and leave it ambiguous as to what particular nuance it may have. So holding fast the word of life, eis kalchema emoi, unto a boast to for me. Very, very woodenly there. Grammatically, this prepositional phrase modifies the participle, but the reference is probably back to everything he's been saying here in this sentence, especially verse 15. Now, a lot of commentators take this as purpose. O'Brien, for example, on page 298, or telic, in the sense of with a view to. That's Fee, page 248. But is Paul really saying that the purpose or goal of their being blameless and shining like lights in the world and holding fast the word of life is in order that he can boast? Ace here more likely, I think, signals result, and that's a common usage you can find in the lexicons. So the CSB, the Christian Standard Bible, captures this nicely. Then I can boast. You're holding fast the word of life, then, as a result of that, I can boast. Now, Fee notes that this noun, kalchema, I'm quoting now, this noun, kalchema, vis-a-vis kalchesis, refers not to the actual act of boasting, but to the grounds for such. That's page 248, footnote 39. Now, in general, words ending in cis often refer to actions, while nouns ending in ma refer to results of actions. So you can think of baptisma as baptism is what happens when you baptizo. Pneuma is what happens when you pneo. When you breathe, you produce breath, pneuma, and so forth. Now, this distinction is not always followed, especially in the Hellenistic period. And so it's possible that Paul is using kalchema here to refer to an activity, his future boasting, and that's how many people take it. So let's look at the text a little bit further and then come back to that issue of whether this is the action of boasting or a grounds for boasting. And that's emoi here. What's emoi? Emoi here is sometimes taken as a dative of possession, my boast. I think probably it works better as a dative of advantage. And so if we take this as a grounds for boasting, holding fast the word of life unto a grounds for boasting for me would be a very wooden way we could get that. Or we could say it more smoothly, holding fast the word of life resulting in a grounds of boasting for me. In English, the emoi works better if we turn it around and make that the subject, so it's something like, then I will have grounds for boasting. Eis hemeran Christou, in the day of Christ. Then the last part, hoti uk eis kenon edramon, uda eis kenon ekapiasa. Is this hoti the content, or is it causal? Those are your two main options. If we take kauchema here as the grounds for boasting, then this hoti works well as causal. A grounds for boasting because I did not run eis kenon, nor did I labor eis kenon. However, most English translations translate hoti as that, as giving the content of Paul's boasting in the day of Christ. Hellerman on page 138 thinks hoti for content, in other words, indirect discourse, points to kauchema as the action of boasting. Therefore, that's the content of this verbal idea of boasting, like indirect discourse. But Fee on pages 248 to 249 shows that hoti for content also works well when we take kauchema as the grounds for boasting, and he cites the Revised English Bible's translation, which has proof that I did not run my race in vain or labor in vain. And I think that works well. So edramon here is a second aorist from tracho, and eis kenon is yet another prepositional phrase with eis. Kenos has the basic sense of being empty, and Danker's Concise Lexicon notes that in the New Testament it's used metaphorically for something that's without anything, empty-handed, without result, in vain, for nothing. BDAG puts our verse in the section 3, which says pertaining to being without purpose or result. In other words, in vain. Now, how's eis functioning here? Hellerman cites Robertson's large grammar on page 550 for eis having an adverbial force. So I didn't run in vain, with being an adverbial idea of how one would run. Abbott Smith helps us see how the imagery works here by glossing eis kenon as in vain, but also to no purpose. So again we see eis with the idea of result, resulting in nothing. I didn't run with no results. I didn't labor with no results, unto no, resulting in nothing. So that kind of analysis may help you see how the language is working. Doesn't affect the meaning. The meaning is still the same whether you translate it in vain or some other way. And so the final clause, the second half of the compound hoti clause, adds a second reference to Paul's apostolic ministry. He ran and he labored. So again, some very interesting imagery going on in here. I came across recently a British understatement of this same kind of idea. It's in a letter that C.S. Lewis wrote to J.R.R. Tolkien shortly before Lewis's death, in which he said, quote, "All my philosophy of history hangs upon a sentence of your own. Quote, deeds were done which were not wholly in vain." Nice British understatement there. And so we continue to see references in this letter to Paul's own ministry. And then our next sentence will tie this reference in to the vision of Christ that Paul's working with in this passage. And so we're going to see more clearly how the hymn earlier in chapter 2 is influencing this whole section.